The first couple of days passed quietly. I spent my time hiking through the woods, reading, and sitting by the lake. The air was cool and refreshing, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. At night, the darkness was deep, except for the light of the full moon and the soft orange glow from my fire. On the third night, I was woken by a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me from sleep. A crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves, came from outside. I lay still, listening. My heart raced in my chest, and I slowed my breathing as I strained my ears. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound didn't return, and eventually I fell back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were faint but clearly human. I stared at them for a while, trying to figure it out. They led from the woods to the cabin and stopped near the porch. There were no tracks leading away, meaning whoever had come didn't leave the same way or was still around. A sense of unease washed over me. This wasn't a well-traveled area, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Maybe it was a lost hiker or someone needing help, I thought. But I hadn't heard anyone calling, and the prints didn't look fresh. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself I was overthinking it. I even hiked to the lake again, hoping the fresh air would help clear my head. But the feeling lingered. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees. That night, I locked the door and windows before going to bed. I kept the fire going longer than usual, the flickering light giving me some comfort. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually exhaustion took over. I woke up to another noise, this time louder. It was a thud, like something heavy hitting the porch. My eyes shot open, and I sat up in bed, heart racing. The sound came again, followed by a slow creak, like someone stepping onto the wooden boards. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window. The cabin was dark, except for the moonlight filtering through the trees. I hesitated before pulling back the curtain, dreading what I might see. Nothing. The porch was empty, but as I scanned the tree line, something caught my eye, a figure. A man standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the shadows. He wasn't moving, just staring in my direction. I froze, my mind racing. What was he doing out there? Was he the one who left the footprints? Why wasn't he moving? I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, watching him. He didn't move at all. Eventually, I couldn't stay awake any longer, and I went back to bed, though I didn't sleep much. By morning, the man was gone. I spent the day inside, too scared to go outside. I kept checking the windows, half expecting him to appear again. When the sun started to set, I added more wood to the fire and kept the flashlight close. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time it was a soft tapping, like fingers on glass. I turned toward the window, and my stomach dropped. The man was standing right there, his face nearly pressed against the glass. I jumped up, grabbing the flashlight and shining it directly at him. He didn't flinch. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He just stood there, staring. I grabbed the heavy fire poker and stood my ground, my hand trembling. After what seemed like forever, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care that I still had days left on the rental. I just wanted to leave. But when I stepped outside, my heart sank. All 4 of my car's tires were slashed. Panicked, I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away. I thought about hiking to the main road, but the idea of leaving the cabin made my skin crawl. What if he was still out there? I spent the day barricading the doors and windows. I found an old hunting knife in one of the drawers and kept it close. As night fell, I felt trapped, like a caged animal. The noises started earlier this time. Footsteps circling the cabin, a faint scratching on the walls. Then came the tapping on the windows, louder and more persistent. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching the knife, my heart pounding. The noises stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the door handle rattled. I held my breath as the door creaked open. The barricade held, but I knew it wouldn't last. The man stepped inside, his pale face glowing in the firelight. He looked at me, and his lips curled into a smile. That's the last thing I remember before everything went dark. When I woke up, the sun was rising, and the man was gone. My car was untouched, and there were no footprints or signs that he had ever been there. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the way he looked at me. I left the cabin and never went back. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still see him standing in the shadows, watching. I decided to rent a small cabin tucked away in the woods for a week of escape. It was the kind of solitude I longed for after a hectic few months in the city. No emails, no traffic, no constant noise. Just me, nature, and pure quiet. The cabin was located in the northern part of Idaho, surrounded by miles of forest and a small pond just a short 5-minute walk away. It was late October 2023, and the trees had already lost most of their leaves, covering the ground in shades of brown and gold. The cabin itself was old but solid, with a scent of pine and age in the air. The furniture was simple but cozy, including a wood stove, a modest kitchen, a single bedroom, and a squeaky porch that faced the thick forest. A dirt path led up to the cabin, but I couldn't see it from where I stood. It felt like I was the only person left on Earth, and at that moment, it was exactly what I needed. I've always liked the thought of being alone in a secluded place, just me and nature. In 2017, I rented a cabin far from civilization, deep in the woods of rural Vermont, for a long weekend. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged in an old postcard. A small one-story log cabin with a porch that overlooked a thick forest miles away from any town. The cabin had been built in the 1960s. While it had modern amenities like running water and electricity, it still felt disconnected. Exactly what I was looking for. At the time, I had just turned 35. Life had worn me down. Work was overwhelming, my social life was non-existent, and I felt like I was losing control. A solo retreat to nature seemed like the perfect escape. No calls, no emails, no worries. I packed just a few necessities: canned food, a camping stove, a knife, and a couple of books. I left my phone at home on purpose. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, and I arrived in the late afternoon. The place was tucked away in a dense forest, with a narrow gravel road leading to it. The nearest neighbor was at least 5 miles away, and the silence was almost deafening. The cabin smelled of pine and old wood, with one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a cozy living room with a fireplace. The windows were small and dusty, and the only light came from a few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling. It wasn't luxurious, but it was perfectly cozy. I spent the first evening unpacking and taking a walk around the area. The forest was thick, stretching as far as the eye could see in every direction. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and no sounds of human life, just me and the trees. The first night passed peacefully. I lit a fire in the fireplace, read for a while, and eventually fell asleep on the couch. I didn't hear a single noise all night, which was a welcome relief from the constant buzz of city life. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike. I had a map of the area, though the trails were poorly marked, so I made mental notes of landmarks as I walked. About half a mile from the cabin, I found an old wooden bridge crossing a creek, and further down the path, a large boulder that looked like a bear. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I began to notice how quiet it was, too quiet. There were no birds, No sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves. Felt odd, but I convinced myself it was nothing. After about 2 hours, I decided to turn back. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. I cooked a simple meal on the camping stove and ate it on the porch, watching the forest darken. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just inside the tree line about 100 yards away. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but it didn't move. It was too far to make out clearly, but it looked like a woman, wearing what seemed to be an old, torn dress. I stared at her for a while, trying to make sense of it. My rational mind told me it was just another hiker or maybe a shadow cast by the trees, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I stood up and called out, but there was no answer. When I went inside to get my flashlight, the figure was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise seemed amplified, the creaking of the wood floors, the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind or the creak of the porch. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The hunting knife was on the coffee table just out of reach. I sat still, barely breathing, as the footsteps continued, stopping near the front door. I wanted to grab the knife and check the door, but my legs felt paralyzed. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't open, but it rattled as though someone was trying to force it. Finally, I snapped out of my paralysis, grabbed the knife, and crept toward the door. The rattling stopped before I could reach it. When I opened the door, no one was there. I stepped out onto the porch and shined my flashlight into the woods. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but all I could see were trees and shadows. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. The next day, I stayed inside the cabin, too uneasy to venture out. I didn't hike or even leave the cabin at all. I locked the doors and windows and kept the knife close. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a flicker of a shadow, the rustling of leaves, but I could never be sure. As evening approached, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and prepared to leave first thing in the morning. The last night was even worse than the one before. Around 2 a.m., I was woken by the sound of tapping on the bedroom window. It wasn't the wind or a branch. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There she was, the same woman from earlier, standing a foot away from the window. Her face was pale, her eyes dark, and her expression was blank. She didn't move or blink. I stumbled back, my heart racing. When I gathered the courage to look again, she was gone. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed awake, clutching the knife, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, I packed up and left without looking back. Afterward, I reported everything to the local sheriff, but they couldn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. I never returned to that cabin, and I don't plan to. Whatever I saw, or thought I saw, felt far too real to dismiss. All I know is that I wasn't alone, and I never want to be again. It was early October of 2019, and I was 29 years old. My work was draining me, and I was in dire need of a break. I'd always loved the outdoors, and camping had always been my way to escape from the pressures of daily life. So, I packed up my gear, threw it into my aging SUV, and drove 3 hours to a remote forest in West Virginia. I didn't have a specific campsite planned, just a rough idea of where I wanted to set up my tent, somewhere away from the crowded areas. The air was cool and refreshing as I arrived late in the afternoon. The forest was a mosaic of autumn colors: reds, oranges, and yellows, covering the ground like a blanket, crunching under my boots as I searched for the perfect spot. After about 20 minutes of walking deeper into the woods, I found a small clearing near a creek. The sound of the water flowing was soothing, and the solitude was exactly what I was craving. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started a fire. By nightfall, I had a simple meal cooking over the flames, just some canned chili I had brought along. The night was quiet, the kind of peace where you can hear every leaf rustling, every snap of a twig, every distant call of an owl. As the fire crackled, I leaned back in my camp chair and gazed up at the sky. The stars shone brighter than I'd seen in ages, reminding me why I loved being out in nature. Out here, everything felt simpler, quieter. Around 10 p.m., the temperature dropped, and I added another log to the fire, deciding to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes, listening to the gentle flow of the creek nearby. But then something woke me. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling outside. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound persisted. It wasn't the usual scurrying of a squirrel or the soft crunch of a deer moving through the brush. It was deliberate, slow, and heavy. I held my breath, trying to hear it better. The sound circled my tent, stopping every few seconds before starting again. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to remain still. I wasn't about to unzip the tent and check it out. Instead, I reached for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. A small but sharp blade meant more for utility than self-defense. Minutes passed, and the sound slowly faded. I began to relax, convincing myself it had been some curious raccoon or something harmless. But just as I was about to drift back to sleep, a noise froze me in place. A low, guttural grunt, followed by a high-pitched, almost human-like whine. I sat up, gripping the knife tightly, my eyes scanning the shadows outside the tent. One of the shapes didn't look right. It was taller, thinner, and the way it moved was strange, unnatural. It didn't sway like a person or animal. It shifted almost like a puppet on strings. Then it stopped. I could hear the sound of breathing, heavy, rasping, not my own. Whatever was out there was struggling to inhale. The shadow moved closer, and I could see the outline of long legs, oddly jointed, in a way that didn't make sense. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in strange sounds that almost mimicked human speech, as though it were trying to imitate the cadence of human language but failing. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of it. Person? No, the shape was wrong. An animal? No animal I knew made sounds like that. The shadow moved again, retreating slightly, and I took the chance to grab my flashlight. I flicked it on and shone it at the tent wall. The shadow vanished instantly, as if it had never been there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle tense, listening for any sign of movement. But whatever had been outside didn't return. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside cautiously, knife still in hand. The fire had burned out, leaving only smoldering embers. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but something felt off. I walked around the campsite, looking for tracks or any other signs of what I had seen. Near the edge of the clearing, I found them, hoof prints, but elongated, as though they had been stretched unnaturally. They didn't belong to any deer I'd ever seen. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling as I shoved the last of my gear into the car. I glanced back at the forest. It was quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I drove away, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a sick animal or that my mind was playing tricks on me from exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That night, I did some research on creatures that mimic human speech, looking into folklore and anything that might explain what I had seen. Most of the stories seemed too outlandish, rooted in legend. But then I found accounts of creatures that could mimic human speech, ones that wore the guise of animals but were something else entirely. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I've never gone camping alone again. And every so often, when I'm by myself in the dark, I think I hear that same rasping breath, that same unnatural whine, just faint enough to make me wonder if it was real. It was early October of 2019, and I was 29 years old. My work was draining me, and I was in dire need of a break. I'd always loved the outdoors, and camping had always been my way to escape from the pressures of daily life. So, I packed up my gear, threw it into my aging SUV, and drove 3 hours to a remote forest in West Virginia. I didn't have a specific campsite planned, just a rough idea of where I wanted to set up my tent, somewhere away from the crowded areas. The air was cool and refreshing as I arrived late in the afternoon. The forest was a mosaic of autumn colors, reds, oranges, and yellows, covering the ground like a blanket, crunching under my boots as I searched for the perfect spot. After about 20 minutes of walking deeper into the woods, I found a small clearing near a creek. The sound of the water flowing was soothing, and the solitude was exactly what I was craving. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started a fire. By nightfall, I had a simple meal cooking over the flames, just some canned chili I had brought along. The night was quiet, the kind of peace where you can hear every leaf rustling, every snap of a twig, every distant call of an owl. As the fire crackled, I leaned back in my camp chair and gazed up at the sky. The stars shone brighter than I'd seen in ages, reminding me why I loved being out in nature. Out here, everything felt simpler, quieter. Around 10 p.m., the temperature dropped, and I added another log to the fire, deciding to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes, listening to the gentle flow of the creek nearby. But then something woke me. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling outside. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound persisted. It wasn't the usual scurrying of a squirrel or the soft crunch of a deer moving through the brush. It was deliberate, slow, and heavy. I held my breath, trying to hear it better. The sound circled my tent, stopping every few seconds before starting again. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to remain still. I wasn't about to unzip the tent and check it out. Instead, I reached for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. A small but sharp blade meant more for utility than self-defense. Minutes passed, and the sound slowly faded. I began to relax, convincing myself it had been some curious raccoon or something harmless. But just as I was about to drift back to sleep, a noise froze me in place. A low, guttural grunt, followed by a high-pitched, almost human-like whine. I sat up, gripping the knife tightly, my eyes scanning the shadows outside the tent. One of the shapes didn't look right. It was taller, thinner, and the way it moved was strange, unnatural. It didn't sway like a person or animal. It shifted almost like a puppet on strings. Then it stopped. I could hear the sound of breathing, heavy, rasping, not my own. Whatever was out there was struggling to inhale. The shadow moved closer, and I could see the outline of long legs, oddly jointed, in a way that didn't make sense. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in strange sounds that almost mimicked human speech, as though it were trying to imitate the cadence of human language but failing. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of it. Person? No, the shape was wrong. An animal? No animal I knew made sounds like that. The shadow moved again, retreating slightly, and I took the chance to grab my flashlight. I flicked it on and shone it at the tent wall. The shadow vanished instantly, as if it had never been there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle tense, listening for any sign of movement. but whatever had been outside didn't return. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside cautiously, knife still in hand. The fire had burned out, leaving only smoldering embers. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but something felt off. I walked around the campsite, looking for tracks or any other signs of what I had seen. Near the edge of the clearing, I found them, hoof prints, but elongated, as though they had been stretched unnaturally. They didn't belong to any deer I'd ever seen. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling as I shoved the last of my gear into the car. I glanced back at the forest. It was quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I drove away, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a sick animal or that my mind was playing tricks on me from exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That night, I did some research on creatures that mimic human speech, looking into folklore and anything that might explain what I had seen. Most of the stories seemed too outlandish, rooted in legend. But then I found accounts of creatures that could mimic human speech, ones that wore the guise of animals but were something else entirely. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I've never gone camping alone again. And every so often, when I'm by myself in the dark, I think I hear that same rasping breath, that same unnatural whine, just faint enough to make me wonder if it was real. It was early autumn, in September 2019, when I chose to rent a secluded cottage in the wilderness of northern Wisconsin. I needed time to myself, away from the city, work, and people. At 33 years old, living in Milwaukee, the constant hustle of urban life had worn me out. The cottage was modest, nestled deep in the forest, and had no internet connection. Exactly what I was looking for. Peace and quiet. The journey took roughly 5 hours. I navigated winding back roads flanked by thick forest, the trees arching overhead to form a canopy that dimmed the sunlight. By the time I reached the gravel driveway, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the woods. The driveway was overrun with grass and brambles that scraped against my car as I pulled up. The cottage looked like its online photos, small, weather-beaten wooden walls, a sharply angled roof, and a porch with a slight sag. It was far from fancy but functional, with a wood stove for heat, a compact kitchen, a tiny bedroom, and a bathroom with running water. Behind it stretched an endless forest. The closest town was at least a 25-minute drive away. It felt remote, just what I wanted. On my first day, I unpacked groceries, stacked wood for the stove, and familiarized myself with the place. The woods around me were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. The stillness was a stark contrast to the constant noise of city life. When night fell, it was pitch black outside. I lit a few lanterns and sank into a chair with a book, soaking in the solitude. The first couple of days passed uneventfully. I spent time walking nearby trails, preparing simple meals and reading. Disconnecting felt freeing, giving my thoughts room to wander. But by the third night, unease crept in. It started as a prickling sensation, as if unseen eyes were on me. I brushed it off, blaming my imagination, but the feeling persisted. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see a figure lingering in the shadows. That night, I woke abruptly around 1:30 a.m. to faint sounds outside. It was subtle at first, leaves crunching softly, but it was enough to keep me alert. Lying still, I listened intently. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate steps circling the cottage. I convinced myself it was a raccoon or deer, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too measured. The steps halted near the porch, followed by the creak of wooden planks. Fear gripped me. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it could be heard outside. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed but stayed still, unwilling to make noise. Finally, summoning courage, I moved to the window. The porch was empty, and the darkness beyond was impenetrable. The footsteps didn't return that night, but I barely slept. The next morning, I found strange footprints near the porch, barefoot, elongated, and unnatural. I stared at them, struggling to comprehend who or what might have left them. I tried to shake the feeling of dread, going for a long hike to clear my mind, but every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. The oppressive sense of being watched never left me. On the fourth night, I locked every door and window, wedging a chair beneath the front door handle for added security. But around midnight, a tapping noise started at the bedroom window, slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. My stomach dropped. The bedroom was on the second floor. Frozen, I listened as the tapping continued, each knock drilling fear into me. Eventually, it stopped, and silence filled the room. I didn't move until dawn. The following morning, I discovered deep scratches on the window frame, as though claws had raked across it. My unease turned into full-fledged terror. I considered leaving but felt an inexplicable force keeping me there, as though the forest itself didn't want me to go. The final night was the worst. I didn't even attempt to sleep, sitting instead in the living room with a hunting knife I'd found in the kitchen. Around 2:30 a.m., the footsteps returned, circling the cottage slowly. They paused, then resumed. When the back door creaked open, I panicked and bolted upstairs, locking myself in the bedroom. Hours passed as I sat shaking in a corner, staring at the door, waiting for it to give way. When dawn broke, I ventured downstairs to find the back door swinging open. More of those strange footprints led from the porch into the woods. Without hesitation, I packed my belongings and drove away, not caring how branches scraped my car as I sped down the driveway. Years later, I still can't explain what happened. I've replayed it in my mind countless times, searching for logic, but nothing fits. I'll never return to that cottage. Even now, sometimes late at night, I hear phantom footsteps circling my home, and I'll never forget the tall, gaunt silhouette I glimpsed as I left that place, standing among the trees, watching me go. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. I was 27 when I chose to leave the bustle of the city for a while. My job at a tech company in Chicago had drained me, and I thought a break from the endless noise and rush would do me good. A friend told me about a small, quiet town in northern Vermont, near the Green Mountains. He said it was affordable, peaceful, and surrounded by nature. It sounded like the perfect escape. I rented a little cabin on the outskirts of town for 3 months and packed up my things. The cabin was a modest, single-story structure with a weathered brown roof and a porch that leaned slightly in the center. It was nestled at the edge of a thick forest, with a narrow gravel road winding up to it. The air was fresh, the nights were calm, and for the first couple of weeks, I felt like I'd made the right decision. My mornings were spent hiking on nearby trails, and my afternoons reading or sketching. The forest was breathtaking, full of tall fir and maple trees that seemed to stretch endlessly. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a bird, and the crunch of my boots on the dirt paths. But there was one peculiar thing: a quarry about 3 miles from the cabin. It wasn't marked on any maps I'd looked at, and I only came across it by chance one day. I had followed a faint path that led me to a clearing. The ground dropped off into a shallow pit filled with gray stones and overgrown brush. Something about the quarry felt wrong. The air was cooler there, and the stillness was almost oppressive, as though the forest was holding its breath. I didn't linger. It was probably just an abandoned quarry from decades ago, yet something about it left me uneasy. In the following weeks, I tried to avoid the quarry, but no matter which paths I took, I always seemed to end up near it. The trails were faint and confusing, and even when I thought I was heading the opposite way, I'd find myself back at the clearing, staring at the gray stones. One afternoon, I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the dirt near the quarry's edge. They were fresh but didn't look like boot prints. They were bare feet, with the toes splayed wide, as if someone had walked through mud and left tracks. A chill ran down my spine. The quarry was far from any houses, and the road to my cabin hadn't shown signs of recent traffic. Who would be wandering barefoot in the middle of the woods? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it might have been an animal, maybe a bear, though the tracks didn't resemble any I'd seen before. After that, though, strange things started happening. At night, I would hear faint rustling sounds outside the cabin. Sometimes it sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps. One evening, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to check. The cold air bit at my skin, and the forest beyond the beam of light was pitch dark. I walked around the cabin but found nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The next morning, I noticed scratches on the side of the cabin. They were long and shallow, as if something with claws had dragged them across the wood. The marks were high off the ground, too tall for most animals. Determined to get answers, I set up a trail camera on a tree near the cabin, aimed at the clearing in front. If anything or anyone was coming by at night, I wanted proof. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, then sat by the fire with a book. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Exhaustion eventually took over, and I fell asleep in the chair. The next morning, I retrieved the camera and checked the footage. Most of it was uneventful, shadows shifting and squirrels darting by. But around 2:30 a.m., the camera captured something. A figure stepped into the clearing. It was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so. The camera's infrared lens made everything appear in shades of gray, but it was clear this wasn't an animal. The figure stood motionless for what felt like forever, facing the cabin. Then it turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees. My stomach churned. It wasn't just the figure itself that frightened me. It was how it moved stiffly, as if it wasn't accustomed to walking. That was the final straw. I packed up my belongings and called the cabin's owner to let them know I was leaving early. As I drove down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching me. It didn't move, even as I pressed the gas and sped away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city. I never went back to the cabin, and I never found out what that figure was. Months later, out of curiosity, I searched online for information about the area. I found vague references to the quarry, but nothing substantial. One forum post caught my attention. It mentioned that the quarry had been used for mining in the early 1900s and that there were rumors of people disappearing around that time. I try not to dwell on it, but sometimes I dream of the quarry. In those dreams, I'm standing at the edge, looking down at the gray stones, and every time, I feel like something is staring back at me. It was late September when I decided to escape to a remote cabin for a peaceful weekend. I'd booked it online, a simple wooden retreat hidden deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains, far from the bustle and noise of urban life. At 35 years old, I'd been yearning for some quiet time away for months. The cabin appeared ideal in the photos, modest, rustic, and surrounded by towering oaks and rough terrain. The drive took nearly 5 hours, and by the time I arrived, the sun was sinking below the horizon. The cabin was smaller than I'd imagined, but had a cozy charm. Made of aged timber, it had a steep, weathered roof and a small porch with a couple of wooden chairs facing the gravel path. There was no cell service, which was fine by me. I wanted to unplug. As I unpacked, the silence was almost unnerving. No car horns, no chatter, only the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle wind. The air carried an earthy scent, a mix of damp moss and cedar. I assured myself this was exactly the escape I needed, a chance to recharge and leave the city's chaos behind. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. A compact kitchen with older appliances, a stone hearth in the living room, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed. It felt homely but slightly neglected, as though it hadn't been visited in years. I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows before settling in for the night. The first night passed without incident. I woke to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight slipping through the thin curtains. Most of that day was spent exploring the forest nearby. The trees were dense, their thick branches twisting upward, and the paths were faint, nearly invisible beneath layers of fallen leaves. The tranquility was both calming and unnerving. It was too quiet. By mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon something odd. A long-abandoned campsite. There was a collapsed tent and a fire pit filled with blackened remains. Rusty cans and scraps of fabric littered the area. It looked untouched for years, yet it filled me with unease. I quickly retraced my steps back to the cabin. That evening, as I relaxed on the porch with a drink, I noticed the woods had changed. The birds had gone silent, and even the wind seemed to have stilled. The air felt thick and heavy. I shrugged it off, blaming my nerves. After all, being isolated like this could easily make someone jittery. Around midnight, I woke to a faint noise outside. It wasn't loud, just the soft crunch of dry leaves. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, closer this time. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Grabbing my flashlight, I tiptoed to the window by the door. I scanned the area outside but saw nothing, just the driveway, empty and bathed in shadows. Still, I felt uneasy. Locking the door again, I returned to bed but struggled to sleep. My mind replayed the noise, imagining all kinds of scenarios. I finally drifted off as dawn's light crept into the room. The following day, I stuck close to the cabin, hesitant to wander after the prior night's strange noises. I spent the morning chopping wood and tidying the porch. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle but persistent, like unseen eyes following my every move. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, but nothing seemed out of place. By evening, as the sky dimmed, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They weren't mine. I'd been wearing heavy boots, and these prints were bare, as if someone had walked around barefoot. A shiver ran down my spine. Who would be wandering out here with no shoes? I tried to reason it away. Perhaps they were old, left by a hiker weeks ago. But something about them felt fresh. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sitting by the fire, flashlight in hand, I listened intently. Around 2 a.m., the sound came again. Crunching leaves, slow and deliberate, this time from the back of the cabin. I turned off the lights and crept to the nearest window. Peering into the darkness, I saw nothing at first. Just as I was about to step away, I caught movement, a fleeting shadow darting between the trees. It was too quick to be an animal. I stayed awake until morning, nerves on edge. When daylight came, I found more footprints, this time encircling the cabin. Again, they were barefoot. They trailed off into the woods. That was the final straw. I packed my belongings hastily, determined to leave. As I loaded my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air around me felt heavy, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. Before climbing into the driver's seat, I noticed something on the porch. A small wooden figure, crudely carved in the shape of a person. My stomach sank. Had someone been here while I slept? I wasted no time and sped down the mountain roads, not caring about speed limits. Hours later, I stopped at a gas station. While filling the tank, I glanced at my car and froze. On the rear bumper was another wooden carving, identical to the one on the porch. I don't know how it got there, and I didn't stick around to find out. I drove straight home, dread clinging to me the entire way. Even now, weeks later, I feel uneasy. Sometimes, when I glance out my window at night, I think I see a shadow, still and silent, watching from a distance.